are the formidable skills of Pakistan in the Benson and Hedges Test Series.
4 runs for victory. Can they make it?
Cricket at its best. The Benson and Hedges Test Series.
In January 1979, the bikini again gained worldwide prominence from Sydney when Lilian Gazinskaya jumped into the West and Sydney's Blackwattle Bay wearing only a red bikini. Lilian had been a stewardess on a Russian cruise ship and, having decided she wanted asylum here, squeezed through a porthole of the cruise ship and won worldwide recognition as the girl in the red bikini. In fact, Lilian's jump into Western decadence was so great that it wasn't long before she wasn't wearing that famous red bikini either. While Lilian made her name jumping into Sydney 12 years earlier, in 1967, Sandra Hilder made her name jumping onto a US nuclear cruiser leaving Sydney.
And what was the security like? It was fairly strong, wasn't it?
It was very strong. They moored it out there for a reason, that no one would be able to get on it. And they had 200 US Marines on board and 2 destroyers either side to keep everybody away.
What prompted it?
Devilment, I think, mainly. The best place for me to go was directly up one and opposite into the Admiral's cabin, because he'd flown out the night before and it was all vacant. The Marine Guards changed. I had a 2-minute interval to get in and lock from the inside, and I had the whole lot.
So you were actually found in the Admiral's cabin? Actually
found in bed in the Admiral's cabin, having a wine, because he had a beautiful bar and everything was there.
Lilian and Sandra put Sydney on the map. For both, the logical follow-on were the pin-up poses. Sydney's famous swimmer-cum-actress Annette Kellerman became Sydney's and the world's first screen pin-up in the early 1900s. Not all women etched into Sydney's history came from the pin-up ranks. For example, Caroline Chisholm, who arrived here in 1839, was given pride of place on our $5 bill because of her welfare work. Mary Reedy was probably the most formidable woman of early Sydney. Transported as a convict, she married a young officer and proceeded to run rings around most of the men in business at the time. Certainly, it was a period in Sydney's history when women had to have amazing tenacity to succeed, and things didn't change all that long ago.
You know, in the early days, one was a bit spooky, I think, assuming leadership in business, which created its problems. But it's a lot easier now.
I started in 1965, and there were problems with bank managers and people in those kind of institutions who couldn't believe that a woman was serious about a career. I find today there are a lot of women who have made a lot of inroads in big business.
In advertising, in particular the creative area, a motherly role is appropriate. You can do that. It's only when money comes into it, big money, and that particular company had I think a $36 million turnover. So there was a general feeling, don't let her near the money, but as long as she's with the people, that's all right. I think that would sum it up.
Did you ever get near the money?
Yeah.
Not all the women involved in Sydney's history have been convict stock either. And while it can't be claimed that she had a dramatic functional role in the development of Sydney, Queen Elizabeth became the first ruling monarch to touch foot in Sydney in 1954. Since then, she's been a regular visitor.
It was not more than a mile from here that I first set foot upon Australian soil on a sunny February morning 23 years ago. This city has been created by the energy and resourcefulness of Australians. May these qualities, which have served them so well in the past, help them also to cope with the problems of the future, so that this fortunate land may remain one of the happiest countries in the world in which to live.
As the whole whirlwind tour proved, Australians still love their Queen.
Probably the most major royal visit before the Queen had been in the 1920s by the Duke of York. The Royals haven't been the only big tours to Sydney in the last 20 years. Another overseas leader that Sydney will mark down as more than just another tourist was President Johnson.
Spring of 1966, but there was little joy. It had become increasingly clear to Americans and Australians alike that the Vietnam War couldn't be won. And when President Lyndon B. Johnson came to Australia, he discovered that not everyone wanted to go all the way with LBJ. The dissidents demonstrated in the streets, placing themselves in the path of LBJ's limousine. When that happened, Bob Askin told the chauffeur to ride over the bastards. And that day, Australians of every political persuasion learned the modern-day meaning of boots and all confrontation.
No face appears on the reverse side of the $1 note. Just a reminder. A reminder of a people who were here when Sydney was settled by a motley collection of whites. A reminder of the people who lasted in their full-blood state only 69 years after Captain Phillip raised the flag. Smallpox, rum, and mixed sex soon put an end to them and their claims on Sydney. We were reminded of that by a protester at this year's reenactment ceremony.
Yeah, go on, that's where you're at, aren't you? Hey? What? If this is a public gallery, hey? What? Where's your badge? Where's your number? You should have one. What's your name? Give it back to the block! Let me go, okay? That's all we say, that's all we say. You got no right to touch my private property. Is this that offensive to you guys? Yeah. Yeah, I know why.
The first Aboriginal really fated by Arthur Phillip and made, quote, civilised, was Bennelong, after whom the Opera House Point was named. Bennelong went to England with Phillip in 1792, but after his return, a slow rot set in. It continues today in Redfern, a place now being compared with New York's Harlem as a hopeless black slum.
Who are we to judge and what we are today? What about white people and look at that, at their face and what they do? Hey? Are we dogs? Are we coming swiftly from the gutter? The same as yesterday?
Look, I see some hope. There is plenty of hope around here as long as everyone that's here is given a fair go. The federal government comes to the party with what it's supposed to be doing with Aboriginal housing, with Aboriginal health. If the state legislation on Aboriginal land rights went through the way that Aboriginal people throughout New South Wales wanted it, I'd see that there is some things that you could do with this treaty.
Do you see any threat of more riots?
I think there will always be threats of more riots, of unrest throughout this community. People here are frustrated. They can't get the things that they want. They're denied access to other areas. And with that sort of situation, yes, there could very well be.
Police maintaining a careful watch on the situation, and with the land rights legislation going before Parliament tonight, it could be a long night. David Allen reporting for Newsworld.
The first major incident between blacks and whites was here at Rushcutters Bay. Two convicts assigned to cutting rushes in the bay, hence the name, antagonised a group of natives and became the first whites killed by Aboriginals in the settlement.
McDonald's Trio Tropical. Yeah, come on in today for a kiwi fruit sundae. You're gonna love it. There's fresh pineapple pie. You've really got to try. There's rich passion fruit taste in a passion fruit shake. You deserve a break today with a Trio your trophies card today.
For a short time only.
At McDonald's.
G'day. Food prices are exploding every day. So we've got to look after our wallets and only buy big money value, big food value, like Sunrise eggs. That only cost you about 38 cents. You separate the eggs, whisk the whites, and then you fold in the beaten yolks. And that goes into a buttered pan, gently heated, and you'll have a fluffy omelette. You brown the top under a griller, then throw in some cooked meat, some veggies, a bit of apple, and that'll cost you just under $1. And you won't put on weight, but your wallet will. Right, Martha?
Here comes tradition. Here comes pride. Here comes the spirit to
Go for the greatness. It's been bred in them to give it their best, to carry the colors and do nothing less than go for the greatness. Go for the greatness. They're part of the side and they know inside that they got the pride to go for the greatness.
take the best that nature has to offer. Add the secrets of a centuries-old tradition. Never stop learning, and it shows in everything you do. Like it shows in every beer we brew.
Go for the greatness.
Carlton, throughout Australia, one of the world's great brewers.
You'll find menswear bargains at Fossey's. Short-sleeve fashion shirts, huge range of colours and designs, great style, and terrific Fossey's value for $12.99. Polyester twill trousers with matching belt, just $14.99. Hard-wearing 5-pocket basic jeans, $9.99. And polycotton sport shirts, $5.99. Cotton canvas tab shorts, look at the price, $7.99. And polycotton jersey T-shirts, they're a Fossey's bargain, $5.99. High quality at low prices, that's why you can say, I found it at Fossey's.
Now on the nation's number one, just looking out into the western suburbs, and there seems to be a little bit of a ground mist out there today. ATF couriers tell us Seven Hills Road running well this morning, and further west one can look up. In 1789, Captain Watkin Tench, going through what is now the western suburbs, said, "Before us lay the trackless, immeasurable desert. The picture of solitude was complete and undisturbed." From that environment, this man wrote his name into western suburbs, Parramatta's, and Australia's history. John MacArthur, the man who got credit due largely to his wife Elizabeth, another of Sydney's unsung female pioneers. The MacArthurs laid the foundations of the sheep industry in 1793 from this farmhouse, the oldest building in Australia, now a part of suburban Parramatta. The arrogant MacArthur was always in trouble. He was called back to England twice to face charges, leaving Elizabeth to run things. Ultimately, he was declared insane. There was a time when what are now the western suburbs could have been the eastern suburbs, because Arthur Phillip thought Parramatta, the place where the eels jump up, was ideal as a site for the capital. In those days, it was actually Rose Hill, an area that abounded in the most brightly coloured parrots. And Phillip called them Rose Hillers, and for trivia lovers, that then became shortened to Rosellas. But it was not destined to become the capital. One of the main reasons, they say, is ships of the First Fleet couldn't sail up the Parramatta River beneath the overhanging trees. As you can see, there are still trees lining the bank today, but I doubt that the First Fleet would have had the same problem. But it's history that Parramatta is regarded as the cradle of development anyway. Apart from Elizabeth Farm, that's perfectly obvious from the dominant position of the old government house here, the oldest public house in Australia. Experiment Farm Cottage, where they used to work out which crops were most suited to local conditions. Lancer Barracks, the oldest continuously used military establishment in Australia. And King's School for Boys, the oldest private school in Australia, opened in 1832 and based on Eton's curriculum. That was 20 years before Sydney University was inaugurated as a completely secular learning institution. That it was without religious bias is remarkable because religion played a key role in early Sydney. The townsfolk were urged to keep the Sabbath very strictly. The first church was finished in 1793, built by the Reverend Richard Johnson and paid for mainly in kind, especially rum. It was burnt down 5 years later by convicts forced to worship there. It was a Protestant church, and non-attendance was a flogging offence. Probably the most historic church in Sydney, St James, was designed as a courthouse, but converted. It was one of the churches preached in by the infamous Samuel Marsden, described by Governor Macquarie as mendacious and vindictive. Historic churches abound in Sydney. And although the current synagogue was built only late last century, Judaism established early in Sydney. In fact, the first Jew came in the First Fleet, and it wasn't long before they had a society for the burial of their dead. There wasn't a Catholic church in Sydney, Parramatta in fact, until the early 1800s, yet St Mary's is the third church built on this site. Incidentally, I want to know what happened to the spires which were meant to go above here, because I can remember vividly giving to a St Mary's Spires building collection when I was at school, more years ago than I care to remember. Still, the spires, or lack of them, didn't worry Sydney in 1970, when the bells rang out for the historic papal visit. It's hard to believe that this serene stretch of water at Sugarloaf Bay, Middle Harbour, has been one of the most deadly in Sydney. It was here we had our most recent fatal shark attack in 1963, when a young actress by the name of Marcia Hathaway died after an attack in only 75 centimetres of water. Most Sydney-siders still know how to treat even the backwaters with respect because of the number of attacks which occurred many kilometres from the sea. The explanation lies in the evolution of the harbour, which 500,000 years ago was the valley of the Parramatta River. The Ice Age changed that, and under these waters is a dead forest which gave way to a harbour, which gave birth to a city. So it was here behind me that Sydney Harbour had its beginnings, when the ocean poured in and formed the rugged headlands. In fact, it is fair to say that Sydney Harbour starts here in the east and finishes over 30 kilometres away in the west, here at this weir behind me in central Parramatta. At least that's where the tidal influence stops and fresh water these days spills over the top to join it. Of course, this is where the surge of seawater actually finished. The actual Parramatta River ends here at Longnose Point. Past here, Port Jackson begins. Now, although in the Sydney story we're using the term Sydney Harbour for the total body of water, it is actually contained within Port Jackson, but excludes Middle and North Harbour. So the defined Sydney Harbour is far smaller than most of us realise. Naturally, islands in the harbour are the peaks within the sunken valley. Probably the most famous is also one of the smallest, Fort Denison or Pinch Gut. Some say it was called that because in the first few weeks of settlement, convicts were left there on rations of bread and water, giving them a pinched gut. But there's also the old seafaring parlance pinch gut, meaning place where a channel narrows. The fort was begun after 2 American warships made their way up the harbour undetected in the early 1800s. Guns were mounted, but never fired in anger. It was hurriedly finished when authorities thought the Crimean War could result in a Russian invasion of Sydney. As it turned out, the threat came from the Japanese nearly 100 years later. It's hard to imagine that originally it was a favourite fishing spot for the Aborigines. And it was still that when the murderer, Francis Morgan, was hanged here. From the gallows, Morgan declared, and in doing so probably became the first person to say, in fact probably became the last person to say so from the gallows, that he had never seen a harbour as beautiful as this from his vantage point. Now, his vantage point was in effect at about the same height as that flagstaff that you see there, although in those days it was a rock outcrop which has since been levelled off, but the gallows were set there. Morgan certainly had time to reflect on his statement in the hereafter, because